know if you've been counting as folks have been coming on screen, but let's go ahead and get the meeting started, and we can start with roll call if that's okay.
Okay, we'll go ahead and do that. Let me just check. Lisa, have you hit the record button?
Yes, we are good to go.
Okay, thank you.
Hey guys, sorry, this is Haley Williamson. I think Commissioner Cordova and I are both in this meeting, but we were both in separate meetings to begin with. I think there's another Zoom meeting happening right now, like where half the attendees are.
I had logged on. This is Tammy Cordova from the website as opposed to from the email, and there were people in there with me. And then Haley texted me to say, I'm in a different meeting. So I don't know if so I left that meeting and came to this meeting.
Okay, and I think I was having the same issue as part of
I think
all of
yes.
my technical challenges. So let's then do this. Either Lisa or Leslie, could one of you try to click over to the other meeting? I clicked from the agenda. That was the meeting that was just kind of sitting and spinning and waiting for someone to admit me. And then this was from the link that you sent to Mr. Gray just before the meeting, the one that we're on right now. So if we can just take a second and maybe go drop this meeting link into that other meeting, if that makes sense.
Yes, I'm going to drop off. I'll be right back.
Okay, wonderful. Thank you. Yeah, sorry about all of this, guys. Yeah, we will. Hang on one second. Let me find that latest email.
Okay, we should be good to go. I announced it and sent the link to everyone.
Okay. Lisa, would you drop the correct link in this chat as well, please?
Yes.
Thanks. Leslie, or Lisa, were there a fair number of people over there? How long do you want to give people to move over to this meeting?
I saw that almost everyone immediately dropped off when I posted it. I think there was only 1 or 2 stragglers.
Okay, great.
Chair Taylor, I have not seen the participant number change. We're sitting at 36 and it's been steady there for a bit.
Okay, then let's go ahead and call the roll.
Okay. Jennifer Taylor,
Here.
Carolyn Turner, Eric Witowski,
Here.
Luke Pepez,
I'm here.
Richard Perkins,
Here.
Elise Porto, Eric Hansen, Jeremy Newman, Assemblywoman Assemblywoman Melissa Hardy, Elizabeth Becker,
Here.
Leslie Mujica,
Present.
Haley Williamson,
Here.
Dwayne McClinton, Ernest Figueroa, Brian Atkins,
Here.
Kayla Dowdy,
Here.
Louis Cruz,
Here.
Jeremiah Drew,
I'm here. Good afternoon.
Tom Burns, Senator Dallas Harris, Senator Pete Gokachia, Assemblywoman Danielle Monroe Marino, John Henry Shields,
I'm here.
we do have a quorum. We have 11.
Is that a quorum then?
Yes.
And that's a quorum of voting members, correct?
Yes.
Okay, fantastic. All right. Well, welcome everybody to the first meeting of the Regional Transmission Coordination Task Force for 2024. Thank you all very much for being here as task force members, being here as presenters, or being engaged members of the public and attending this really important work. So with that, let me go to public comments and discussion as our first agenda item. Ms. Helget, is there anybody wishing to make public comment? Oh, and to the extent that there is, let's go ahead and keep public comment to no more than 3 minutes so that everybody can have an opportunity to be heard.
If you'd like to make public comment, please raise your hand. Chair Taylor, I am not seeing any hands raised.
Okay, thank you. So let's just go through a few housekeeping items and then I will make a few comments and then we will turn it over to our slate of presenters for today. So this meeting is being recorded for everybody's information. There will be a time for questions and answers at the end of each presentation. If we could hold questions from the task force members for the presenters until the end of each presentation, that would be appreciated. To help keep background noise to a minimum, please be sure to mute your microphone when you are not speaking. For task force members during the Q&A, please use the raise hand function to be called on in order. And please be sure to identify yourself before speaking during the Q&A. This meeting is scheduled to run for probably about 2 hours. We have a fair amount of speakers again, as I noted, and we want to make sure that we can get the best information out of them during their presentations, as well as give the task force members an opportunity to discuss issues with them as required by the statute. So just a few opening comments. And then agenda items and presentations will be posted to the Energy Office's website after this meeting. Additionally, we will continue to use the resource pane that is in the task force site on GOE's website to post additional documents, presentations, reports that can be helpful to the task force in accomplishing the work that it was set out to do under Senate Bill 448. For housekeeping items, Ms. Helgett, did I miss anything?
No, it looks like you covered everything.
Okay, thank you so much. So just a few comments. This is my first meeting chairing the task force, and I want to thank Governor Lombardo for giving me the opportunity and the honor of being the chair for this important discussion. I also want to thank former Senator Chris Brooks, who's my predecessor, for both bringing forward Senate Bill 448 to make sure that this was that the idea of a regional transmission organization and how Nevada may join or form a regional transmission organization is something that is robustly discussed, and that we have a body in place to advise both the governor and the legislature on the policies needed to be able to accomplish that task. Big shoes for me to follow, but I know that the senator has laid some good groundwork, and I'm really excited to continue to build on that. I also want to thank Director McClinton and his staff for the work and support in getting this meeting put together. As I noted, there's been a lot of changes in both the market and the market work from a lot of our presenters and the task force as well. So I really wanted to use today as a way to reset our foundation. There's new task force members that may have different types of experience and expertise from task force members that preceded them. Since the first task force meeting in about April of 2022, when some of the introductory concepts were presented. Again, it's been quite a while. It's been more than 2 years, and we have had new members join. And so again, today I want to use as a way to reframe, reground, make sure we're all standing on the same foundation as we move forward towards our assigned task of getting a report ready for the legislature for 2025. As I noted, Senate Bill 448 was passed in 2021. It established the task force with this very broad and diverse set of members that bring different expertise, different experiences, but all are part of the folks that are ratepayers, customer classes, power consumers under different forms of utilities. And so it'll be great to hear from everybody and get their thoughts, their concerns, and their impressions as we move forward. So let me just, again, in the mode of grounding us, take a look at Senate Bill 448 and what it specifically charges us to do here on the task force. So we are assigned the duty of advising the governor and the legislature on specific items. The first is the potential costs and benefits to transmission providers and their customers in Nevada of forming or joining a regional transmission organization, which provides access to an organized, competitive regional wholesale electricity market. Number 2 is policies that will accommodate entrance by transmission providers in this state into a regional transmission organization by January 1st, 2030. Policies that will cite transmission facilities necessary to achieve the state's clean energy and economic development goals. Potential areas in the state where growth in demand for electricity or growth in renewable energy generation would be accommodated by additional transmission or regional market opportunities, and businesses and industries that could locate in the state as a result of the state's position in an organized, competitive regional wholesale electricity market. So again, that's our charge. That's what we're going to be looking at. And the presenters today are going to touch on a number of those items, and we will continue to work through those specific requirements as we move towards putting together a report for the legislature by November of 2024. We're going to hear today from folks that will talk about the basics of an RTO, just again, to get everybody in the right frame, from the PUCN to hear about the important work that they've been doing to set forth some of the rules of the road for those interim steps towards a regional transmission organization and how they're going to look at setting up rules and regulations for an RTO going forward in their work. And then we'll hear from some of the wholesale market entities, the resource adequacy entity, and then some new initiatives on governance, all of which are going to be very important for the work that this task force does and the advice that this task force provides. So with that, I'm going to let you all know that we're going to have a slight change in the order of the agenda, and we will have some changed presenters as we go along, and we'll just go ahead and announce those as we move forward. So first off today, we're going to hear from Spencer Gray, who is the Executive Director for the Northwest and Intermountain Power Producers Coalition, talking about regional markets, overviews, and structures. So Mr. Gray, please take it away, and thank you so much again for providing some time to us today.
Thank you so much, Chair Taylor, for organizing this. My name is Spencer Gray. I'm with NIPSI. NIPSI is the trade association for independent generators and marketers in the Northwest and neighboring states. So just north of Nevada, Oregon, Washington, Idaho, and Montana. And I was asked to give a somewhat high-level overview of regional transmission organizations in general. And I realize here we have senior staff from 2 of the RTO or ISOs active in the West. So the perspective I'm providing here is number 1 at a high level, and number 2 from a neighboring part of the West that resembles Nevada in being largely bilateral and traditionally structured, with a few exceptions. So I'll focus on RTOs at a high level and then touch on a few parts of the Westwide Governance Pathway Initiative that are addressing governance of one of those market operators in the West. We can go to the next slide. So I offer these slides recognizing that Nevada is one of 2 states in the West that does have requirement in state law for regulated utilities to examine and plan to enter into an RTO. And so this audience may be much further up the learning curve than some other states in the West for what an RTO is. But an RTO and its analogous functional equivalent, the independent system operators, which is what the market operator next door technically is, the California ISO. Both of those forms of wholesale market entities are generally nonprofit entities that operate at wholesale rather than at the retail level in the electric market. And they, in addition, are also transmission operators. And I'll go into the details of what unpacking that means a little bit. The movement nationally to concentrate the operations of wholesale electric markets and high voltage transmission with these nonprofit entities really had a watershed day in 1996 when the Federal Energy Regulatory Commission issued Order 888, which is sort of a founding regulatory document for encouraging and outlining the design of these new entities. They emerged from a series of voluntary, increasingly tight power pools in which both private and public owners of generation and transmission around the country voluntarily began pooling both their transmission networks, sometimes under contract, to transmission operators, as well as their generation. And eventually that voluntary movement that began largely in the Midwest and the Northeast led to a more formal set of requirements for what these wholesale market operators and transmission operators would look like. Today, after about 30 years of development of RTOs, collectively, the 7 in the United States manage about 2/3 of power sales at the wholesale level. And the exceptions to that are largely the West as a whole and the Southeast. The key functions of the RTOs are, above all, to ensure non-discriminatory access to the bulk power system, to the high voltage transmission network. The economic thinking that led to the creation of RTOs was had its origins really in the 1970s when natural gas began to be deregulated economically nationally, followed by electricity. And so the creation of independent nonprofit wholesale market operators was an outgrowth of changes in technology and policy preferences among states to essentially open the power grid up to competition. The place where competition began and where it continues to thrive is on the wholesale generation side. And there is some additional competition compared to decades ago in transmission development as well. But the theory was, and is a sound theory, that vertically integrated participants in the wholesale markets who served retail customers, therefore had distribution lines, who owned transmission lines at a high voltage, and who also owned generation, had some natural biases in favor of their own assets. And if we were to move as a region or a country toward a more competitive market where any given entity would have a non-discriminatory opportunity to access the grid, there needed to be stronger rules of the road and a concentration of operating power in disinterested third parties, which is what the RTOs were designed to be. That goes to the second bullet here, that a primary function of the RTOs and ISOs is to operate the transmission networks in a disinterested way. They do not own transmission, they're not asset owners. They operate transmission that's owned by legacy transmission owners as well as developers of new transmission. In addition, a separate but related function is the RTOs operate wholesale energy markets, typically on an auction basis. It's a movement away from bilateral sales of power where buyers and sellers call each other up or email each other or operate on bilateral exchanges online, to a platform where in advance a whole series of generating plants are input into expectations for how much power consumers need in real time. Finally, most RTOs or ISOs also plan regional transmission across their footprints. And this incorporates reliability needs that the transmission operator anticipates. So there's both a planning and an operational function. And I would just again underscore that first bullet, that the reason to have a third party take over the operational control of transmission, in addition to the energy markets, is to help ensure that nobody is favored or disfavored in accessing the grid and developing resources to sell to consumers. You can go to the next slide. From a consumer and sort of public interest perspective, the value proposition for creating RTOs is the list of bullets I have here on this slide. I want to emphasize in describing the value proposition here, there are changes in having an RTO in terms of how transmission rate making happens, the administrative complexity and governance complexities of establishing one of these operators that can cut the other direction. So RTOs are not a panacea. They don't solve every problem. They're not a magical power sector transmission problem solver. But in general, certainly for the part of the electric sector that I represent, independent generators and marketers, they tend to have a sounder structure to encourage competition than the alternative, the traditional bilateral market. The two maps here illustrate the distinction between how we run the markets in the West and in the rest of the country. On the left, you can see the balancing authorities, which are, for the most part, the large vertically integrated utilities and transmission owners in the grid that runs in the 11 Western states, plus a corner of Texas and the 2 provinces in Western Canada, versus the overall structure of the grid in the rest of the country. And so we do have a market operator in the West that has been here for many years, the California ISO. As you'll see on the map on the right, the 2/3 of the power sales that I mentioned are managed by those other groups of RTOs. The small distinction between an RTO and an ISO is the geographic footprint. An RTO under FERC's requirements covers more than one state, and there's a geographic test for whether a market operator qualified as an RTO under a rule about 20 years ago. Functionally, though, apart from that geographic distinction, otherwise the operations of these entities are essentially equivalent. And so in the industry, we often refer to RTOs collectively to describe this suite of market operators. The challenge of developing new generating resources and new transmission across the quite balkanized map on the left is a little bit self-evident. So the intuition that crossing those different jurisdictional boundaries and complying with the rules of different states and different transmission operators and utilities creates a great deal of complexity in managing the transmission network. And so the general value proposition for an RTO, and I say this understanding that Nevada already has legislation on the books, but to sort of restate the basics, in operating a grid that is more seamless, is centralized, is more automated, and has a disinterested operator, both for generation and transmission, the idea is to lower wholesale costs to consumers so that more states can rely on both the geographic diversity of their generation. When it's windy in one part of the West, the sun may be setting in another, and vice versa. When it's really sunny in Nevada or in California, perhaps the wind has died down in Montana or Wyoming. That ability to merge generation that has complementary production profiles is a primary value proposition of RTOs. That has a corollary in that states that are committed and large consumers that are committed to decarbonizing their power supply, it becomes easier to build less generation if the generation you're building is balancing itself better. Additionally, the topic of this task force mission, it can be easier to build transmission when a single operator is looking at a large footprint and able to analyze with transparent public information where the congestion points are, where it would be most efficient to procure new transmission. And additional corollary, the minimization of curtailment of wind and solar resources extends from the geographic diversity I just mentioned. And then finally, depending on the market design and the transmission connectivity, RTOs can also offer additional support for regional resource adequacy. In other words, making sure that there are enough power plants for the very coldest and hottest days of the year so that the lights are on at all hours. We can go to the next slide. This pretty simple table shows, and those boxes I see showing up as squares, those are supposed to be check marks. This shows the suite of services offered by the 7 RTO and ISOs across the country. You can see that the table is organized into transmission functions on the left and energy market functions on the right, with demand response on the far right. the circles at the top show the elements of an RTO that the West currently has. We do have real-time energy imbalance markets operating really across the West. Not every load-serving entity is part of an energy imbalance market, but operated both by the California ISO and the Southwest Power Pool. There's reliability coordination that occurs through both SPP and the California ISO as well. And then finally, in yellow there is the current discussion in the industry about designing and entities choosing between two competing options for a day-ahead energy market, which would be part of a service offering that includes energy in real time. I don't plan to talk about the status of the day-ahead markets today. That's not the purpose of this presentation. But what I want to highlight are those uncircled boxes to the left and to the right, and particularly to the left that are an extension of the transmission functions of an RTO that currently are not on the table as service offerings in the West and perhaps someday will be. One way to think about this is those are the areas of transmission service, planning, rate making reform that other parts of the country elected to undergo. And for some understandable reasons, the West has largely elected not to undergo. But increasingly, as we have transition in the generating fleet, and as the energy markets captured in those circles there have shown the value proposition of more centralized organization of the sector, those transmission functions are becoming more attractive to more participants. And I think that just underscores that the legislation in Nevada and Colorado are not occurring in a vacuum, and the impetus to pass those bills is echoed in many other states who are seeing similar changes in their power grids. We can go to the final slide. Lastly, I wanted to draw a connection here to a narrow but important part of the transmission functions that were listed on the previous slide. A group of about 30 volunteers in the industry, as well as regulators and public interest groups, have been gathering over the past 10 months or so to propose changes to the governance of the California ISO that would lead to a more independent governance approach over primarily the energy markets. But our work, I'm an alternate on the launch committee of this effort, is intentionally extending the governance structure we're working toward recommending toward transmission services too. So I wanted to make sure that the task force was aware that the launch committee of this Pathways Initiative has thought through as a group, and we'll be sharing more about this over the summer, what properly independent governance of potential future transmission services that are typical of an RTO, including those required in the Nevada legislation, would be possible in the state of California. The list of services provided here is drawn straight from the straw proposal of the Pathways Initiative from a couple months ago. I want to underscore that I'm not providing a pitch here for the California ISO or for EDAM. These services are very similar to what the Southwest Power Pool provides as well. Our task as a volunteer stakeholder committee is to attempt to make sure that the governance of the California ISO operated transmission services offers a level of independence that is similar to what other RTOs, including SPP, can offer to the West. That is not yet the case, and it's our hope that it can become the case over the coming year. That list of bullets under transmission control, I think, is the place to really concentrate on thinking about what future transmission services in an RTO mode would look like that could affect Nevada. This includes the operational control of transmission that I mentioned a few slides ago, the consolidation of a single transmission service tariff rather than consumers and developers having to rely on navigating multiple transmission service tariffs, the use of flow-based rather than point-to-point physical contract-based transmission, which is a much more efficient way to operate and schedule transmission, as well as the depancaking of some transmission rates. The obvious place to start to meld the cost of developing new transmission is for new lines. It's a much trickier question that deserves a lot of discussion about what to do with existing lines and legacy rates for transmission. So closing with that connection to an ongoing effort in the West is where I wanted to end.
Thank you, Mr. Gray. I will open it up to the task force. Does anyone have any questions for Mr. Gray based on his presentation? Okay. I have a couple quick questions. If you could go back to your slide that preceded this one with the service offerings. Okay. Nope, next one. That one. Thanks. Just because of, I know we talk a lot about generation with this, but I would, if you have a few comments on the demand response elements of RTOs and how they both help shape that load and manage the grid and provide those opportunities for resource adequacy as well, and how you might see them fitting into a Western market. Again, at a very high level, and just some initial thoughts on that.
Sure. So one way to think about an RTO is it is an institution created to aggregate different resources. The resources can be transmission, they can be generation. The geographic diversity of renewables across a very wide area is the example I mentioned earlier. This is also true on the supply side. And so in a bilateral market, in the absence of a central wholesale aggregator, programs for demand response tend to rely more on contracts and arrangements between two parties, between a large consumer of energy and a utility, for example. That would be a typical example. What an RTO can allow you to do is to take those largely bilateral arrangements, aggregate dozens of them in a way that they can participate in a wholesale market, even though many of those demand response programs are happening at a retail level. This is something that the Federal Energy Regulatory Commission has encouraged, and it's really difficult to have that aggregation service outside of the complementary services listed on this table. And so it opens a new tool, I would say, for demand response to work on a region-wide basis and to monetize it better.
Okay, thank you. And then one other question that I had is you mentioned again at a very high level the work of the day-ahead markets from the Western entities that are providing offerings right now. And I wondered if in context with your comment that an RTO is not a panacea, if you might mention some of the value propositions of a full RTO versus staying with a day-ahead market, which is where a lot of the utility thoughts are right now in the West. And again, just to the extent that that's something that you've thought about and at a high level, that would be great.
Sure. The way I think about an RTO is all things being equal, and that's a really loaded phrase. All things being equal means that regulators and policymakers and market participants, for example, are satisfied that the way the market is governed is fair and isn't dominated by a set of market participants or a particular state or region. So I don't want to skip over that point, but all things being equal, in my view, there is a lot of value being left on the table by the West moving in an incremental or evolutionary way toward energy market service offerings that an RTO provides without changing the underlying transmission paradigm. It is generally more expensive. and sometimes simply cost prohibitive to add new sources of generation to the grid to enable programs like demand response that we just covered, unless you've really tried to address the balkanization of the transmission tariffs, the rules by which transmission owners determine who gets to plug into the grid and how they get to use the transmission lines. The current system relies on a legal fiction of physical contract path rights from point to point across what's a network flow. We've certainly gotten better than we used to be at trying to make that legal fiction correspond better to the physics of the power network, but it will never approximate it as well as using a better network basis. So those series of reforms that the West so far has left on the table, and I'm not saying it's going to be left indefinitely outside of Nevada and Colorado, but it adds up to greater costs for generation developers, for marketers, for utilities and consumers. The thing that would be given up, and it is a difficult thing, is individual control over a given transmission owner's rates and operations of their network. And that's nothing to sneeze at. It's a difficult evaluation by each asset owner. And to have a critical mass of the transmission owners decide that that's in their best interest or the best interest of their consumers at the same time, that's why we've struggled for 30 years to make this decision. Some of those transmission owners are jurisdictional to FERC. They're private investor-owned utilities. Some are not. They're consumer-owned. So for historic and governance reasons, the West has struggled to move forward on transmission reforms, but I think there's a lot left on the table.
Okay, thank you so much. I'll open it up to anybody else on the task force that may have a follow-up question for Mr. Gray. Okay. All right, Mr. Gray, thank you. Oh, unless the commissioner had a question, or were you just getting ready to go for your, okay, great. Thank you, Commissioner. Mr. Gray, thank you so much again for your time. Enjoy your conference, and we will look forward to further discussions with you and the opportunity to hear from your expertise on all of these issues. So thank you.
You bet. Thanks.
Thanks. Okay. Commissioner Cordova, nice to see you. I'm very glad to hear that your docket stipulated and you can join us today with some flexibility. So I will pass the presentation over to you.
Great. Thank you so much, Chair Taylor and all the members of the task force. My name is Tammy Cordova. I'm a commissioner at the Public Utilities Commission of Nevada. And some of the information I'm going to be talking about is available on our website. So our website is at the bottom of the slide. And I just want to preface my comments with saying I am a member of the commission. So I'm just, speaking based on my own information. I'm not speaking for the commission. And I'm going to be very careful to make sure that I'm not prejudging any issues that might come before the commission at some point in the future. And to that point, it's great that Spencer went first. I know he had to run, but thank you, because I am not a markets expert. So I appreciate him discussing some of the transmission issues and market issues, because I'm really just going to try and stay focused on what we are doing at the Public Utilities Commission. So next slide, please. So this is just a little overview. I was going to kind of talk at a high level about the energy markets that we have available and what the commission's jurisdiction is, because I think that's a nice foundation of where we are in our current investigatory docket. Then I'm going to kind of go into the work that we've done and the work that we still have to do in that investigatory docket. So next slide. So I really liked how Spencer talked about this kind of an evolutionary process that we've had in the West when we talk about transmission systems and the different market opportunities. This slide was just intended to kind of set a baseline to say, this is what an energy market does for you. I think probably everybody on this task force already knows this, but it's a nice place to start with as we build into potentially having an RTO in Nevada. And that is that, energy is difficult to store. So the system has to be balanced at all time, which is what makes the transmission system so critical, and who's controlling the transmission system and how they're going about doing that, and where markets can come into that activity, because it's not like a lot of markets where supply and demand can be adjusted. Supply and demand in this case have to meet each other when you're talking about an electric market. Next slide, please. So one of the first things that the West did look at was a real-time energy supply market, and that's the EIM. I think everybody's familiar with that. And that usually runs about once per hour and once every 5 minutes, but runs about every 5 minutes. So it really is intended to be a real-time opportunity to balance the system and maximize and optimize the resources that are available. You can see the slide that probably all of you have seen that comes from the California ISO that shows the current participation in their energy imbalance market. So that's kind of your first step into a market, is that snapshot of the real-time opportunity. From there, then what we've done in the West is now we're looking at a day-ahead market. Next slide. So in a day-ahead market, now you're looking a day ahead. You're not looking just 5 minutes ahead. You're looking a day ahead at the opportunities to optimize the buy sell. I know we have folks that are coming after me to talk about the different day ahead markets that are available. And so in the docket that I'm going to talk about that the commission has been working on and investigating, the first phase that we've done in that docket is really to talk about what are the characteristics of a day ahead energy market that might be of value to Nevada. So let's go to the next slide. One thing that we should all keep in mind, and I think Spencer talked about this, is that when you talk about a regional transmission organization or an independent system operator, you're talking about something that includes the real-time market, it includes the day-ahead market, and then it has all of those other features that I think Spencer laid out that you can see some of them listed here. And part of, as the state regulator, the real concern that we have is that, and Spencer talked about this, is when you start talking about an RTO or an ISO, it's more than just that kind of balancing market function that then becomes a responsibility of someone outside of the state. All of these other things, management of the transmission system, ensuring non-discriminatory access, the dispatch of the generation assets, and regional planning for that system. You can see, go ahead and go to the next slide. So on the next slide, you can see here, and it's similar to a map that Spencer had, where the Northwest and the Southwest do not have an RTO. And that's a huge chunk of space across the Western United States, where there have been a lot of discussions about developing an RTO. And I think Spencer did a nice job of talking about, what is the value proposition of an RTO? I don't necessarily think that that's my place as the state commissioner to talk about that, but I do have a few points here. The concern and the trade-off always is that to the extent that you hand over functions to an RTO, the RTO is not regulated by the state, it's regulated by the Federal Energy Regulatory Commission. I think they do a fabulous job, but it is just a different entity. So it's something that the state has to work through as we're thinking about what are the folks in Nevada going to do once we move toward a more regional organization that is regulated by the FERC as opposed to by the PUC. Next slide. So I wanted to just quickly talk about the commission's jurisdiction. I think everyone here is probably familiar with the PUCN and probably familiar with NV Energy, but our primary duty is to set electric utility rates, approve electric utility plans to serve the load, maintain the resource adequacy of the system, and ensure compliance with the various state laws that are passed by the legislature. Next slide. So as Chair Taylor mentioned, the legislature in 2021 passed a law, and that was Senate Bill 448. Senate Bill 448 said the commission shall require, the commission being the Public Utilities Commission, every transmission provider in the state to join a regional transmission organization on or before January 1st, 2030. Now, in that law, there is also a provision where the Public Utilities Commission is supposed to take a look at that request by the provider to ensure that that request is in the public interest. So to the extent that there is not the opportunity to join an RTO, or the opportunity it doesn't look like it's in the best interest of Nevada. The commission is going to have to take a look at that. And kind of hearkening back to where I started in 2014, the commission did authorize NV Energy to join the California ISO's energy imbalance market. And NV Energy has announced that it's going to seek authority at some point in the future to join a day-ahead market. So that's all in the mix, along with this provision from SB 448 that requires Nevada to look at an RTO. Let's go to the next slide. One of the things that certainly it's become abundantly aware to me, I've learned a lot in a lot of these market activities over the past couple of years, is that Nevada really is unique. It's a fabulous state. We have really just one utility that serves the vast majority of the customers in the state. We have a single balancing area authority in NV Energy that currently balances our transmission system. And that means that, those customers in the state that are not NV Energy customers, the transmission system for the whole state is still balanced by NV Energy. And we also have a renewable energy mandate, which not all of our neighboring states do. So that's something that we also have to take in consideration as we're having this conversation. Next slide. Here you can see the footprint of the Nevada Rural Electric Association. These are the areas in Nevada which are not part of NV Energy system. And these folks will also be affected by any movement by NV Energy and Nevada as part of their balancing area authority to move towards an RTO, a day-ahead market. Some of them, may or may not be participating in the energy imbalance market in California. So these are the folks, in addition to, we have some NRS 704B customers and other kind of transmission level customers that are not necessarily NV Energy retail customers that need to be part of this discussion as we move forward. Next slide. So I tried to fly through all of that because I think a lot of that was similar to what Spencer was talking about. But I did want to just talk about the investigatory docket that we've been doing at the commission. This is docket number 20-23-10019. As I mentioned previously, all of the information in the docket is available on the commission's website. Next slide. So in this docket, we held several rounds of workshops. We had several rounds of comments. And initially, we just started off with a conversation about kind of what's going on in Western market activities. And then it became apparent that what's the saying about eating the very large animal and you have to do it one bite at a time, that really we just needed to eat this animal one bite at a time. And so we started off with kind of narrowing our scope to just talking about the day-ahead markets. And so our workshops included presentations from the California ISO and from the Southwest Power Pool, because they are both currently working on a market offering that is a day-ahead market that NV Energy was participating in. And so we had those folks come in and speak to the commission and answer questions. We also had several rounds of comments, really focused on, what are the features of a day-ahead market that would be of value to Nevada, and specifically to assist the commission, what is the type of information that the commission should consider when it's evaluating whether or not a day-ahead market is in the public interest for Nevada. Next slide. So just last Friday, Chair Taylor's timing is impeccable because we just released an order and a report last Friday, which is on our website. And the order adopting the report basically lays out that the purpose of the report is to identify what should be the requirements for NV Energy to come forward to the commission and request to join a day-ahead market. And then it highlighted that then the next phase, we will move further into other kind of Western interconnection, regional transmission types of activities. So we're by no means done, because I think the bite we already took of the animal is a very small bite. I think we've got a lot of big bites still to take. Next slide, please. So the next few slides, because this is a very long list, so I'm not going to read it to you, but these are all of the specific pieces of information that we thought might be relevant as a result of all the workshops and all of the comments that we got. It was a lot of very diverse parties that commented, which was very helpful to the commission because this affects all different types of industries in Nevada. Were the types of information that we want NV Energy to provide so that the commission can evaluate them. Governance is certainly in there. Financial health is in there. Transparency of market data, diversity of resources. Let's go to the next slide. Resource adequacy requirements for the state, our RPS, how does it impact that? Revisions to the OAT, for those of you that are not familiar, that is currently the tariff under which transmission level customers take service in Nevada. Is that going to change if we join a day-ahead market? How is it going to change? Let's go to the next slide. And this is the end of the list, but certainly more information on cost benefit analysis. One of our workshops did include some presentations on cost benefit analysis, but we want to see what information is available so that we can do an assessment whether this is in the best interest of Nevada. And then some other information about capital investments and costs. Let's go to the next slide. NV Energy has indicated that it may file an application with the commission later this year to request authority to join a day-ahead market. If they do so, any request that it makes, any application would be docketed, it would be noticed, it would be reviewed, and public hearings would be held such that then the full commission can make a decision. So to the extent that we've been doing this investigatory work, to the extent that NV Energy currently has a pending IRP, it's really important to myself, at least, that we have kind of a separate proceeding where we can have a robust conversation about the next step forward that Nevada might take towards a day-ahead market. Next slide. And then finally, phase 2, coming attractions. We're going to move forward and continue with our conversations and kind of take the same approach. What is the type of information that the commission's going to need? If we talk about Nevada joining a regional transmission organization, we've got that requirement that's laid out in SB 448, and things always take longer than we think that they will. And so I think the commission needs to get started with trying to determine what criteria should we use, what information will we need, are there additional rules and regulations that we're going to need. So I'm hoping that, those of you on the task force and those of you that are listening in different organizations, we really appreciate that kind of robust participation so that at the point at which I think it's 2027, where the commission's going to need to determine, what if we do about SB 448, we'll have the information we need to do that. And next slide. So thank you so much, Chair Taylor and members of the task force. I'm available for any questions.
Thank you very much, Commissioner Cordova, for that thorough overview of both the uniqueness of Nevada and the work that you're doing. The question that I had you kind of wrapped up with, which was, how do you see the work you're engaging in this docket as informing what you may have to do in 2027? And basically, correct me if I'm wrong, this is, again, some of the groundwork and the foundation so that when 2027 gets here, you'll be able to have the rules of the road to assess those items necessary for your charge under Senate Bill 448. Is that correct?
Yes, I think that's fair. I mean, I certainly think, at least for my commission, given that Nevada hasn't participated in an RTO up until this point, having this investigatory process has been very helpful in just, bringing our staff members up to speed, creating a place where we can have educational sessions to learn what sorts of information we're going to need to have. And so that's where we're continuing to move forward to make sure that we're getting everybody in the place that we need to be with the information that's available, so that we can make that decision when we need to.
And to the extent that there are still engagement opportunities well, I guess I should go back and say, are there still engagement opportunities in the investigatory docket for those parties that may want to weigh in, attend hearings, attend workshops? Do those still exist, and how do folks get involved if they're interested?
Absolutely. Thanks for the question. There is a process on the commission's website where you can be put on the service list so that all information in the docket is automatically emailed to you, or you get a notification. I should fix that. You get a notification when information has been made available in the docket. But for any of you that, don't want to navigate, our website is currently having a few issues. Just shoot me an email and I'm happy to get you in touch with whoever you need to get in touch with to make sure that that happens for you. Because we're going to have more workshops. There's going to be more comments. And I certainly find, like Spencer's presentation before me, I've seen him at a bunch of stuff. He's very well informed. There's a lot of folks out there that know a lot more than we do, or a lot more than I do, at least, about some of these issues. And I appreciate that input.
Yeah. And I think that's one of the things that's really great about this task force and that the work that you're doing is that there are very few people who have that wholesale expertise in what we're trying to do. And so having these different pieces of the puzzle together to try to create the whole, I think is really good. Anybody else have any questions for Commissioner Cordova? Okay. Commissioner, again, thank you so much for the time. Thank you for putting together a great presentation, and we'll look forward to hearing updates from you as you move forward with this docket. And thanks again. Have a wonderful week. Okay. So next up, we will move from the sort of overviews to a little bit of a discussion of the organizations in the West and how they're working. The first we're going to hear from is the Western Resource Adequacy Program, kind of again how they distinguish themselves from an RTO, what they do, and how they support energy resiliency and energy adequacy in the West. Mr. O'Brien, anybody else that we're adding to the presentation today, or is it just you?
It's just me, Chair Taylor.
Wonderful. Okay, take it away. Thank you.
Thank you. Good afternoon. I'm Michael O'Brien. I'm the Senior Engagement Manager for the Western Resource Adequacy Program. That's the RAP at the Western Power Pool. And spoiler alert, right at the beginning, the RAP is not a market. And that's something I'll be emphasizing throughout. But I'm delighted for this opportunity to give you an overview of the RAP and also an introduction to the Western Transmission Expansion Coalition. That's WestTEC at the end. If we go on to the next slide, please. Thanks. WPP last spoke to this committee 18 months ago, so we have a lot of progress to report. First, I want to briefly put the RAP in the broader context of the work undertaken at the Power Pool. Then we'll dive into the RAP program by discussing the roles of the Western Power Pool versus Southwest Power Pool. This will be followed by a framing of the RAP value proposition, which really has reliability at its core. Then we'll go down the rabbit hole on the forward showing aspect of the program. This is the advanced planning part that Spencer alluded to. So following that, we'll discuss the operations component of the RAP. This happens in the operational time frame, so operating days and days ahead, where participants that have capacity surplus to their forward showing needs are matched with those that have a deficit. And I'll explain how the planning and the operational components are linked. Then we'll conclude on the RAP with discussing where we're at right now with our participants and where we're going over the next months and years. And that will be followed by a brief discussion on the Power Pool's latest endeavor. That's the Western Transmission Expansion Coalition. So next slide, please. So very briefly, the Western Power Pool has been operating for over 80 years, providing services that are more efficiently delivered through regional coordination rather than by an individual utility, say, going out on its own, in particular, reliability and planning services. But given the relatively limited time today, I'm just going to zoom straight in and focus on the RAP. And it's important to note that since RAP got FERC approval at the beginning of last year, we currently have an independent board at the WPP, which was something we didn't have until we got the FERC RAP. So this slide is just to show you that the RAP is just one part of what the Power Pool does. And this can be seen even more clearly on the next slide. So in black is the current footprint of the RAP. Last year, we gained a new participant, bringing the total number of voluntary participants to 22. So RAP got started back in 2019 when many of these entities on the left of the screen here began sharing observations about the very real problem of resource adequacy, which at a high level is just making sure that there's enough resources to meet load under a variety of conditions, including some extreme conditions, especially as more variable resources were coming online, coal plants were coming offline, loads were expanding due to electrification and data centers, and all against a backdrop of increasingly extreme weather conditions. So the FERC approved tariff that enabled the RAP was the product of years of work and collaboration and negotiation between not just the participants, but other stakeholders as well. So as I mentioned at the beginning, all this leads to that RAP is not a market and it's not creating a new one. And that in this operational component of the program where energy is exchanged, that's still exchanged bilaterally between participants. There's no market role there at the moment. So before we go any further, the next slide describes the roles of the participant administrator and the program administrator and the program operator. So WPP, we serve as the program administrator, and that role is defined in the tariff, and we are entirely responsible for running the RAP. The buck stops at us. The tariff also describes the program operator, and that's defined as a third party who we contract with for technical and analytical support towards implementing the RA program. And we hired Southwest Power Pool SPP for that role. So it's important to note that while SPP's role in RAP is critical and very important, it is purely contractual. Our relationship with them does not in any way extend to market or market support. And RAP really does seek interoperability with both CAISO ZDAM and Markets Plus, SPP's Markets Plus, and we have been engaging in their tariff developments to that end. So the next slide, before we go into the more detailed design, it's just a little discussion about the value proposition of the RAP. So there's a couple of foundational terms and concepts to explain. So at the highest level, the forward showing component of the RAP is about planning to make sure that participants have adequate capacity so that they can deliver to their loads under a variety of circumstances. And then the ops program is linked to that by allowing the participants who have surplus capacity to those needs to help those out that don't, those that are deficit. So we can see that the RAP proposition, value proposition at its core is about reliability. But on top of that, there's this consistency and transparency in metrics that we're working upon. And so we're building upon the region's utility by utility planning, integrated resource plans, etc. We're trying to work together to develop a common set of metrics to analyze how our increasingly diverse resources that we have across the region can meet the needs of our rapidly diversifying loads under a variety of circumstances. And this diversity is key. The benefits of the RAP really hinge on the diversity of resources, loads, and transmission across a broad footprint. So to that end, as you're no doubt some of you are aware, we're working towards a binding construct, which is what is noted on this slide. So what does it mean to be binding? What does it mean to be non-binding? Well, in the RAP, binding just means that there will be compliance consequences in terms of financial charges that I'll explain to participants for failing to comply with the requirements that they have designed and signed up to, or if they fail to cure any deficiencies that have been identified. So this binding construct will eventually apply to both the forward showing planning component and the operational component. And the planning component, this is where each participant shows their loads and resources 7 months ahead of the 2 seasons in the RAP, and that's summer, which runs from the beginning of June to mid-September, and winter, which runs from November to mid-March. And then there's the operational component, which we've talked about matching those with capacity surplus to their forward showing planning needs to those that do not have enough. So together, these components, planning and operations, should help us to maintain reliability by holding the appropriate amount of capacity collectively, and also driving upstream investment decisions on both generation and transmission. So while the ongoing value RAP proposition will always have reliability at its core, participants will have different starting points in the RAP. So in which case achieving resource adequacy could come with increased investments in the short term for some. Now, currently, everyone in the RAP, all the voluntary participants that have signed up for the tariff, they're still non-binding. So we're still working on how they do the planning and how they do the operations program, a lot of learning by doing. But RAP does have an on-ramp in the tariff, and that's called the transition period. And it's a 3-year period between 2025 and 2028, where a participant can choose one of the 6 seasons to choose to go binding and expose itself to potential financial penalties. And the incentive during the transition period is that those financial penalties are quite substantially reduced. So when we discuss the latest and greatest at the end of this presentation, we'll return to the RAP participants notification at the end of last month, I think, that they're aiming for a critical mass to go binding in 2027. And they've also indicated their intent to revise that transition plan, that on-ramp into binding that I discussed. But first, on the next slide, let's just begin digging into the design of the program. So I'm just going to give you an overview of the 2 components, as the details have solidified over the last year or so since the tariff was designed, which is obviously highly legal language, and we've been working on writing that up into a series of business practices. So the forward showing program, this is this advanced planning piece, and we'll go into each of these boxes in a little bit of detail. The first one is to determine the forward showing capacity requirement. So this is the monthly compliance obligation that each participant has to meet 7 months ahead of the beginning of those summer and winter binding seasons. So each of those seasons, summer or winter, has the months in it, and each of those months will have its own capacity requirement that needs to be met. So how is that amount of capacity determined? Well, the program operator gathers data from all the participants about what resources they have, what loads they have and expect to have, and then runs a loss of load expectation study. And so that just determines the extra capacity above the load. That's what's known as the planning reserve margin, or PRM, that's needed to ensure a 1 event day in 10 years loss of load expectation. In other words, the amount of extra capacity needed so that every 10 years during one of these seasons there's a single outage due to a lack of capacity being available. And so that's the regional reliability metric that's being used collectively by the RAP. So that leads to a planning reserve margin, a little bit of extra capacity above load needed for each month of winter or summer. So for example, say it could be 20%, and every participant will have the same PRM percentage for each month of the binding season, but they apply that to their subjective and individual load forecasts. So a participant with a large load to serve would have a larger forward showing capacity requirement than one with a smaller load, but they still use the same percentage PRM applied to each load. Just a slight caveat here, the RAP region is currently divided into 2 footprints, the Northwest and the Southwest, due to transmission constraints that exist between the 2. And that's how we model it right now. We are working on trying to explore the extent to which we can allow some transmission between the 2. But in those 2 subregions, at least, whichever subregion you're in, all the participants have the same PRMs that they use per month. So then they have to somehow meet that requirement. And this is the second box here. They have to determine the capacity requirement of all the resources they have. And those resources could be physical generation that they own, or it could be a contract that they have, or a system sales that they buy. So to begin with, participants provide SPP, the program operator, with information about the performance and availability of their generation over the last 10 years or so. And that's done 2 years ahead of each season in what is called the advanced assessment. And that data feeds into that loss of load study that I mentioned, but it's also used to compare when those resources are available to the hours where the historical need for capacity has been particularly high. And so we call these the capacity critical hours. And so that correlation for wind or thermal, that correlation between when they have been available and when they're needed, that leads to what we call the qualifying capacity contribution of the resources. Similar concepts you may have heard of are like capacity value or capacity credit. So for each month in each season, winter and summer, each participant has its forward showing capacity requirement based on the planning reserve margin needed to ensure reliability and their own load forecast. And then they add up the QCCs, they stack them up of all their resources and contracts for each month and see if they add up. And that calculation is called the forward showing, and that is what is done 7 months ahead of both the summer and the winter seasons. So in addition, they do have to show that they have sufficiently firm transmission rights to meet 75% of that total capacity requirement when they submit their forward showing 7 months ahead of each season. That's called the forward showing transmission requirement. And the participants included that in the design just to ensure a certain level of deliverability between loads, contracts, between resources and loads. So if planning ahead, a participant sees they're short in either their capacity needs or the transmission needs, they can start trying to fix that before the forward showing deadline. But at some point, they get to the deadline, they submit their information about how they're trying to comply with their forward showing capacity requirements. And then we have 2 months to analyze them and let them know you're deficient in this area or that area. Then they have another 2 months to try and cure those deficiencies. If they fail to cure the deficiencies and they are binding, which I note we're not binding right yet, they expose themselves to forward showing deficiency charges. And these charges are based on what we call the cost of new entry, a new plant coming onto the system. But fundamentally, it's just publicly available EIA data relevant to the annual capital and fixed costs of a hypothetical natural gas peaking facility. So say you're a certain number of megawatts short in your forward showing planning, that number of megawatts you're short maps over to $1 per megawatt price equivalent to a gas-fired peaking facility. So the idea of this deficiency charge is to strongly motivate the participants to comply with the program metrics in the forward showing planning horizon. It's not meant to be an economic alternative to compliance. And just to stress that it was the participants themselves that designed this program and these incentives for participation, and they voluntarily choose to sign the tariff. So the next slide is the counterpoint to the forward showing planning piece, and that's the operations program. So that advanced planning forward showing, that was happening 7 months ahead of either the summer and winter season. But the operations program, that happens during those winter and summer seasons. And it's fundamentally about matching up those with surplus capacity to their needs with those that need capacity. And that matching ends up happening on an hourly basis. And to begin with, things can change between the forward showing deadline and an operating day, obviously. So the initial phase of the operations program compares that earlier forward showing forecast look for a particular month to the actual operational reality in a week or a particular day. Between when they made their plans and what's happening right now, a plant may have gone offline, load may have been higher or lower than they predicted, variable resources such as wind, solar, run-of-river may have performed differently. So the forward showing is compared to what's actually happening, and then we can determine whether a participant has excess capacity to their needs or is in some sort of deficit. And then the participant has excess is obligated to hold back some of that capacity in case the deficit participant wants it. And if they do, they call upon it and they have to deliver. And this is where the rubber hits the road between the forward showing, the planning, and reliability on a daily basis. But this becomes a little bit clearer in the next slide. There's a lot to try and explain in terms of the ops program, but this might help a little bit. So each day of a season, winter or summer, is called an operating day. And consideration of any particular day in the winter or summer begins 7 days in advance, so a week in advance on a rolling basis for each day. And this analysis rolls out throughout the entire season. And that brings us to the operating hour of an operating day. So participants with a deficit in this hour will have formally requested any energy deployments they needed on the day before. That's the pre-scheduled day. And those who had surplus identified in the 7 days leading up to that operating day will have been required to hold back some of that capacity. It's then called upon and they need to deploy it. And that's then resolved through bilateral transactions between the participant in surplus and the participant that has a deficit using existing trading mechanisms. So the settlement prices, if you use the wrap, are high enough to try and encourage them to resolve it outside of the program, but not so high as to be punitive. They're basically indexes with a 10% adder. So this is kind of like an insurance or a backstop, but the hope is that opportunity has been created for a participant that knows it has a deficit to try and find that capacity and energy before relying on the program. Now, if a participant is called upon to deliver and they don't, then we enter the realm of delivery failure charges, and they can rack up pretty quickly and substantially because if you fail to deliver, then you're leaving another participant hanging. And they can go from 5 times the energy index price to up to 50 times the energy index price per megawatt, depending on whether that participant has failed to help someone out before, and also depending on whether someone else came in at the last moment to help the person who was deficit. So it's quite substantial quite substantial delivery failure charges there. Bit of an echo, sorry. I'm just to wrap up this bit on the wrap on the next slide, where we are right now. We're currently in our summer 2024 season, so we're in a non-binding operations program. So there's a lot of data flying around between participants, a lot of learning by doing, but there's no charges for deficiencies or failures. People are just setting up their IT systems so that they can send the right data files to the program operator on the multi-day and the day-ahead basis about where their resources are right now compared to where they were in the forward showing. Earlier this year, March 31st, participants submitted their non-binding forward showing for the upcoming winter 24-25 season, and right now we're reviewing their deficiencies with them. And the end of May this year was the deadline for participants to indicate that they wanted to go binding in summer 2026. You have to give 2 years notice. And that brings us to the final slide for the wrap. So on April 22nd this year, the wrap participants sent a letter to the region. They reaffirmed their commitment to the wrap program, but wanted to highlight a few things as context to the decision about when to go binding. They noticed that they had been pursuing resources and contracts, ownership and PPAs, and there'd been more efforts on the transmission front through WestTech and the West-Wide Government Pathways Initiative that was just discussed, but they were encountering friction and supply chain issues. So while wrap was more important to them than ever, given the magnitude of deficiency charges they could be exposing themselves to, they felt that summer 2026 was too soon to go binding and expose themselves to those penalties. So they took advantage of the flexibility allowed by the tariff, and they're working towards a critical mass in 2027. And as part of that, they're going to revise that transition plan, that on-ramp into binding, by changing some of the mechanisms surrounding how much the deficiency charges are reduced. And that's currently happening in closed meetings right now. So that's the end of the wrap. I have maybe a couple of minutes on WestTech I could finish up with. I think I'll just do that now So the Western Transmission Expansion Coalition effort, that takes place at WPP. It's not something I personally work on, but it's trying to facilitate new and improved conversations on regional transmission planning. It's not focusing on permitting or cost allocation, and it's trying to be different to what's happened before in that it's really striving to be actionable. It's looking 20 years ahead at new transmission and also 10 years ahead at what grid enabling technologies might be able to be used in the nearer term. It's trying to be expedient by leveraging existing resources that we might have or capabilities, such as those through WEEB. And it's trying to have as broad and inclusive a table as possible, from the industry that set it up through to state regulators and representatives, utility boards, tribes, customers, all involved to try and make sure that what comes out has as much buy-in as possible. So I think I'll just jump to next slide, please. Thanks. So my colleagues that work on this wanted me to emphasize a couple of things. That this is not a FERC process, it's a study. There are potential synergies down the road with FERC Order 1920, but they're still in the early days of discussion. And so what they're working towards right now, the steering committee and the technical committee, both of which they have representation from NV Energy, Interwest, and WAPA, is the study plan. So that's what data will go into the studies for this 10-year and 20-year outlook. What will assumptions be about electrification and load growth? And there will be an opportunity to comment on that study plan on July 19th. And then the aim is to get the work going September this year, and then August next year, report back on the 10-year outlook. That's with the nearer term solutions. Then October next year, report back on the 20-year outlook. So hopefully that will lead to some new lines on maps in terms of an actionable study, so that hopefully, say, a group of utilities will have the backing of this study and the stakeholders involved with it in it, so that when they get to the siting and permitting, they'll have more of an actionable foundation. That's the idea anyway. So watch this space for West Tech. And then that concludes my presentation.
Thank you very much.
Chair Taylor.
Thank you, Mr. O'Brien. Does any member of the task force have a question for Mr. O'Brien? Okay, just a couple quick ones from me. So 2 questions. Number one, are there analogous RA programs and entities in other markets, regional markets across the country, and any of the other RTOs?
So I think the closest ones would be the ones run by SPP in their RTO, which is why we contracted with them to be the program operator. And so they put out PRMs for their members, and we've used a lot of the similar software that they've used, but the design of our program is slightly different because comes from our own participants. But it's quite similar to what I described here, with some Northwest nuance due to hydro specifically. And then there's also the California ISO. They do have an RA program that's run by the CPUC. And that I know they're currently undergoing a review of that. And I don't want to speak for them in any way, but our PRMs are a little more granular than those used in the California RA program. So there are 2 out there, but they're kind of bookend in terms of the level of analysis that they use.
Thank you. And then I don't know if you have the ability to provide a real world example of how RAP has functioned in, say, some of these summer high heat domes or high grid demand that we've had over the past couple of years, to sort of show the efficacy of the program, as, you know, in its non-binding state right now, but to show sort of the efficacy of the program, if you've got an example, if that's something you can share.
That's not something we're able to share right now. We're only in our 2nd non-binding operations program. So we're still trying to get to the level of data quality and assurance, before we can start making kind of predictions or statements about heat domes, etc. So when the RAPC put out their letter, WP also put out our letter. And one of the things we did emphasize was the need for all participants to submit sufficiently high level of data as required by the tariff. So we're still working through a lot of that. There's still a lot of systems being set up to make sure that the data is being provided and the right data is being provided. But everyone's working really hard on trying to make sure that they understand where the holes are. And as we get through season, we'll get closer to being able to make these kind of statements on the heat domes. But right now in the operations program, no one is required to help each other out. We're still working towards that.
Okay. Opening it up one more time to anyone else on the task force for any questions for Mr. O'Brien. Okay. Sorry.
Oh, thank you, Chair Taylor.
You're welcome. Thank you, Mr. O'Brien, and look forward to hearing more from you as the programs continue to grow, get finalized, more data comes in, and look forward to hearing potentially more about West Tech. Thank you for giving us that overview and watch that space timeline. So thanks again. Have a great rest of your Monday and a great week.